All right, Mike. Happy New Year. Another year, another load of nonsense with
Well, I
Drakeford
was going to say,
version.
how did you manage to survive over in Wales with all the restrictions from Mr. Drakeford?
Well, ironically, Mike, I came down with a common cold. Remember that thing that
Oh
people
yeah,
used to get?
yeah.
Yeah, I came down with that one over
Did you
Christmas.
self isolate as a result and warn
Well,
everybody to stay away from you?
I was struggling to do my exercise. I tell you, I was feeling far worse than when I had COVID a few months back.
I mean, that
And
is the thing. I mean, I had a terribly bad cold back end of sort of December just passed, and it was a lot worse than the COVID that I'm being told lasts for about 3 days and is a bit like the sniffles, you know.
Yeah, well, I've had two vaccines, so some people are saying, well, COVID would have been worse, but obviously I wouldn't know because a lot of people have different effects with COVID. But it's just some absolute nonsense. I was just reading actually, Mike. I just put a tweet up that because in Wales, Mark Drakeford's going to be getting up in about an hour's time. You probably won't get much challenge from the journalists in Wales, as if they're kind of in the pocket, the
Mm.
journalists in Wales. It doesn't get any challenge. And he's going to announce, I think they put a press statement out later last night that restrictions are going to continue. But there's an interesting story coming out this morning, Mike,
Mm.
in Chester. So Chester football team, I put a tweet out
I've seen
because
it,
their
yeah.
football ground, the stands are on the Welsh side of the English-Wales border. The car park's in England, and the actual border goes through the back end of the stadium.
Right.
Because the stand where the fans are standing is in Wales, technically now they're in breach of Wales's COVID restrictions, and the police and the council are looking into this
What a
because they've
joke.
been playing a. So come on now, this is absolute nonsense.
Right. Now the
And these are the
rules,
kind of
if
things
I'm
that we're
correct,
living with, Mike.
so correct me if I'm wrong. So the rules in Wales would say that they can't have more than sort of 40 or 50 people there, right?
So they can't have more than 50. So
Yeah.
we had in on Boxing Day, Mike, we had this situation. So Mark Drakeford says, I want to keep Wales safe. So this is the situation we had on Boxing Day when these new rules came in, that people were going along to say the local rugby stadiums. Only 50 of the fans could watch the game outside in nice fresh air. I think it was raining, so it would have been a bit wet for them. But 150 of them were packed into the clubhouse watching it on the TV. So you've got this farcical situation now, Mike, where fresh air outside, low risk of catching COVID. Nope, can't do that. Go indoors, spread it potentially if you've got it, airborne transmission, you can do that. And they've not changed that today, Mike, whatsoever. Absolute bonkers.
Yeah.
And, I have no idea what Mark Drake was playing at the moment.
So what do you think is going to be the end result? Is there a game today then at Chester? Is that what you're saying?
No, so there was a game. I think they've been playing a couple of games since the restrictions came in
Oh, I
on
see.
Boxing Day. So they've already breached the restrictions, they're saying. So that's why
I,
the police are now looking into it.
I
So our
mean,
taxpayers' money is going on the police looking into why Chester had fans on the kind of on the Welsh side of the border that goes through the
yeah.
stadium. Absolute nonsense, Mike. It's just and in terms of there's a lot of criticism coming at Mark Drakeford at the moment because there's talk of the Welsh. There's a Six Nations coming up, obviously,
Yes.
and fans in Scotland and in Wales won't be able to go to the matches for those home games. So there's talk of perhaps Wales and Scotland playing their games. Maybe Scotland would play at Newcastle. Wales could go over to Manchester or Liverpool. But I can guarantee Mark Drakeford has not changed the restrictions now. But a lot of people in Wales, Mike, don't watch Mark Drakeford's kind of speeches. They don't watch the media. They don't read the newspapers. They probably think we've got the same restrictions as kind of what Boris says.
Mm.
There'll be a lot of people like that in Wales. There's no way Mark Drakeford, I can probably say to the listeners, this is my prediction, will allow the matches to go over the border. He'll probably reduce the restrictions in time because that's when the man on the street and the woman on the street will start realizing how bonkers
Yes.
some of the rules are coming in.
Well, given that Boris Johnson didn't do what Wales and Scotland did and now looks to have done the right thing, are there not people in Wales and probably there certainly are in Scotland that I've talked to saying, hang on a minute, he's obviously gone sort of a bit over the top here, hasn't he?
Well, I think so, Mike. But just before Christmas, when he announced the restrictions, he said that the Omicron variant was the evidence that he was seeing. It was probably just as bad. We know that's not the case. Interestingly, now, Mike, we've got the case rates per 100,000 across the four home nations. England has the lowest rate of the four countries.
Yeah.
So, we've talked in the past, these restrictions of stopping, how many people can sit in a restaurant and you can't put a mask on when you stand up, can't go and watch a football game outside. They're not, they're just tangible things that have very little impact
Mm.
on kind of COVID, especially with Omicron, Mike,
Yeah.
where things it's just far more transmissible. So, it's probably more to do with politics, as far as I'm concerned, because we had the British Medical Association in Wales yesterday saying, Mike, that we went into the pandemic in Wales with not enough staff, not enough beds. So I think the restrictions in these countries is probably more to mask the
Mm.
fact that the NHS has been poorly managed for decades,
Right.
rather than the fact that we're in a health emergency.
Yeah, well, I think the only place that the NHS is in worse shape than it is in England is in Wales, where the Labour government there seems to have been running it into the ground for years.
Yeah, you had Richard Tice talking to me earlier on. He said to ask me about the bed occupancy stats. So I just looked them up actually. So it's a bit hard to find them all. So in England, this is interesting, Mike, and I'll probably do a little bit more and put some stuff on my Twitter on it.
Yeah.
So we've had figures this morning on how many patients were in critical care beds on the 2nd of January 2022 in England. So 3,055 patients in critical care beds. So I went and had a look at what was the number 2 years ago, just before COVID hit us. 3,075. So there were 20 more patients in beds in critical care before COVID than what there is now.
Yeah.
So I'm going to look at the back series, but we obviously COVID makes it a bit more difficult when you got to separate patients. But I think the narrative is that the NHS has been massively overrun because of this pandemic.
Well, it hasn't,
Actually,
clearly.
It was overrun before.
Yeah, well, exactly right. And it's always overrun. I mean, you can go back 20 years and I can find you a front page of either the Mirror or the Guardian telling us that, the NHS is overrun. There's not enough doctors, there's not enough nurses. I mean, the current problem, obviously, is that they don't have enough actual people at work because they've sent them all home, right?
Yeah, so I looked at this. We had the updated stats on that this morning as well, Mike. So there's about 39,000 staff. It says off sick with COVID. Now, some will be off sick, I'm sure, but there'll be a lot of people who are probably fine because this is a very mild variant. They probably wouldn't have even known there was a difference between having a cold or having COVID. And they've just obviously because there's a lot of testing going on. So that's doubled over the Christmas period.
Yeah.
But we saw Omicron in London earlier, Mike, and the numbers of staff off in London is starting to come back down again. So I'd imagine it's just going to be one of those things that ride it out for 2 or 3 weeks and then things will start coming back to a bit of normality. And remember now, Mike, the reason that the NHS is kind of struggling a little bit more than say this time last year, because the staff sickness rates aren't much different to this time last year, is the fact that we've had all these kind of non-COVID patients going in because they've been kind of told to protect the NHS for the last 20 months.
Right.
Now they've reached the point where their body needs protecting themselves. So,
but then we also know from the NHS's own admission over Christmas that basically an awful lot of people who are testing positive for COVID in hospital did not go into hospital because they had COVID. They went into hospital for something else. Then they got tested because I think they test everyone as soon as they get in there. And many of them are asymptomatic. They don't actually show any signs of having COVID, but they count as one of the stats.
Yeah, so let me just explain kind of this. There's 2 parts to this, Mike. So they produce, and we should get some numbers updated today on how many patients are in hospital, but they're not in there primarily for COVID. And there's 2 parts to this. There's those who are in the community who need admitting to hospital, and they wouldn't have been admitted for COVID, but they've got COVID, but they needed to be admitted for other reasons. So there's those bits. But the more worrying ones are the ones that get added to the daily figures. And they're the ones who went into hospital for something else. They were tested, they were negative. And then at a certain point later, when we can kind of be more confident that they definitely didn't have COVID when they went in, they caught the virus in hospital. So it's about 20% of all the admissions added to the figures each day are those people who caught it in hospital. And it could be up to another 20% on top who've come in from the community. So, you're talking somewhere between 33, 42% of the figures are patients who would have been in hospital anyway, but they have COVID. Now, in Wales in the latest week, Mike, because I was just looking at them yesterday, it's a staggering 50%, but they don't tell you that, the ministers. Mark Rayford, when he gets up in an hour's time, he'll talk about the impending emergency on the NHS. He'll talk about the fact that admissions have gone up, nearly 100% in the last week, but he won't mention the fact that a massive vector of that increase are patients catching in hospital. People will say when the virus is transmitting in the community a lot, it's more difficult to control. I accept that. But 20 months in, there's talk about calling for a Welsh inquiry. We've seen a lot of deaths from people who caught the virus in hospital. What's changed? I've seen people in South Korea, Mike, when they're showing the hospitals there, the equipment and the masks and stuff that they're using on their COVID wards is absolutely different to what we've got. Maybe they've got it right over there and we've got it wrong here. Who knows?
Yeah, difficult to know, isn't it? What I can tell you is that I've just seen a stat which says that on January the 2nd, the numbers of NHS staff absent from work had risen by 59% on the previous week. And this week alone, it's 3 times higher, the number of absentees in England in the NHS, than it was this time last month.
Yeah, and that's the kind of the figures that I was just talking about, that in London, they are starting to come down. They went up dramatically in London. And that's in part, Mike, the problem that we've got now. In that, there's two parts to this, isn't there? There's if somebody's got a light kind of Omicron and they don't feel too bad, should they go to work? But then there's if they do go to work and they do pass it on to somebody else in the hospital who are more vulnerable and they die, there's an issue there. But as you were talking about with Richard earlier on, we can't continue with this testing. At some point in the next 6 months, we need to have a policy now where Boris said last year we need to learn to live with COVID. Well, we clearly haven't learned to live with COVID. But in 6 months' time, if this Omicron variant continues to demonstrate what it is, that it's more like a common cold than that first variant that we had that was significantly killing a lot of people, then we've got to move away from even self-isolating if you've got COVID. That's the kind of the way we need to get to. Mike.
Well, I think so. And one of your other tweets about the numbers of people actually dying across England and Wales for the most recent week, 6.5% of deaths only due to COVID, which means that basically 93.5% of deaths were nothing to do with COVID.
Indeed, Mike, and deaths have been coming down. Now, interestingly, this is going to be a good call out. I can tell the listener that I predict that the number of COVID deaths reported by the government will go up over the next few weeks and probably the next month or so. But that's a quirk of how the government present the numbers. Now, if you had a scenario where 100% of the population had Omicron, we know there's about 11,000, 12,000 deaths a week in England and Wales. So what you'd have there, Mike, is 11 to 12,000 COVID deaths because they're all deaths with a positive COVID test. Now, given the facts and figures I've just told you about the numbers going into hospital now with COVID, but not specifically for it, and it is rising because of Omicron, we will inevitably start seeing more deaths with Omicron, but not because of it. But that won't be explained on the daily figures. So when they do go up, I'd probably treat it with a bit of caution. What we need to look at, Mike, are the total number of deaths that get reported, regardless of what the cause is. Let's see if that goes up. I very much doubt it'll go up at all. If it might go up a little bit. But the important thing is, Mike, we still are seeing more people dying for the time of year for non-COVID reasons. Again, the narrative all over the newspapers, all over the kind of the BBC, ITVs, it's just COVID, COVID, COVID. We've got, this huge health emergency, non-COVID, which, we've got to sometimes start shining a light on that.
Well, exactly right. Ian's asking a question. Could you tell us if the hospitals are still social distancing beds in wards? I haven't heard that they're not, so I'm assuming they probably still are.
Yeah, I assume then they are as well. And in a way, that kind of what makes things a little bit more difficult for the hospitals, because I'm not sure why you would need to socially distant patients if they've all tested negative.
Well, yeah, or indeed if they're all tested positive. The point is
exactly,
that
if they're all on the COVID ward, why would you need to
But that's it. An awful lot of it is by their own hand. An awful lot of the problems that the NHS is having to deal with is problems they've created.
No, indeed, Mike. And let's look at some optimism in the figures, really. That South Africa, where, the SAGE was saying we can't follow the South African scientists. We've got to follow our own things. The SAGE modelling is, again, Mike, we've talked about this in the past, the SAGE modelling has just been proven to be absolute nonsense. Yeah. Oh, just a joke. They were saying potentially up to 3,000 deaths a day, averaging 100. There's, I put my house on the fact that we won't get anywhere near 3,000 deaths a day. I can put my house on that. Absolute nonsense. So it's a shame I can't go down the bookies and have a bet on some of these things, because I'd probably be living in a mansion.
Well, maybe somebody will make you a book on it. I mean, maybe that's what SAGE have been doing all along. Maybe they've been putting out these predictions and then betting the other way. Who knows? I mean, there's got to be some reason for them to do it. I mean, none of the other reasons make any sense. But this is the thing. Stay with us for a moment, Jamie, though. We've got some other things we want to get through with you. Another thing or two we want to ask you. You've got any questions for Jamie? This is a man who cuts through any of the nonsense that you might be hearing from anybody else in the business of the media, in the business of COVID, in the NHS, in any statistical way, shape or form. He will tell you precisely what the stats say, what they mean, and where we're really going, which is why we love him. It's why we have him on the show. Jamie Jenkins, independent statistician, independent being the word. This is Talk Radio.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to the Independent Republican, Mike Graham, right here on Talk Radio. We will take some of your calls coming up very shortly. We're also going to talk about bringing back the national anthem for the BBC. Remember, they used to play it at the end of business every single day. They don't really ever end anymore, and I suppose they might say that's why they don't do it. But I'm sure there will be other nefarious reasons as to why. Andrew Rossendale, the MP, Tory MP, has asked for them to do it again. We've got a poll running on Talk Radio's Twitter account, which at the moment actually surprisingly even, 49 to 51 against us playing the national anthem. We're talking to Jamie Jenkins right now over in Wales. He was telling some fascinating story about Chester Football Club, which apparently is partly in Wales and partly in the Britain, or partly in England, I should say. Chester FC, the postal address, says Peter, is in England, and so it won't be covered by Wales. Directly from the police are missing in action. Well, that may well be the case, but they're certainly looking into it, and we'll find out whether they wish to try and punish anyone. I don't think you can do that, really. I seem to remember, Jamie, actually, back in the day when there was restrictions being put on pubs in those days, those heady days of tier 2 and 3 and 4 and all that there was a pub that had a car park, I think, in Wales, but the pub was in England, or the other way around. I can't remember. So you could, I think the pub was in Wales, so you could park in the car park, but you couldn't go into the pub.
Well, and the problem is, Mike, you know, it's funny to laugh and joke about some of these things, but there are some real kind of heartbreaking stories. And, you know, if you home one of these places on the border, there are people who've got, you know, if you live in Wales and on the border, you just pop over to England, spend all your money there, and you just got empty kind of pubs and stuff because you can't get the trade. And what's I tell you what, Mark Drakeford said, you know, these restrictions are coming in on Boxing Day. They then announced there would be £120 million worth of funding to support things, but you couldn't apply until the 8th of January, probably because all the civil servants were off for Christmas.
No doubt.
Nonsense, Mike.
It really is. And I mean, are the people of Wales starting to get a bit fed up with it? Because we were listening to Richard this morning, Richard Tice, talking about the schools up in the northwest of England, an awful lot of kids just saying, we're not doing the mask thing, we're just not wearing them. And once that kind of thing starts to pick up and it starts to gain momentum, there's very little the authorities can do, really, isn't there?
No, I know of more and more people who are getting fed up of it, but I think that, you know, the Welsh Labour government do these polls, and there's been such a big propaganda campaign, and the national newspaper in Wales is practically, you know, a Labour mouthpiece, Mike. That a lot of people.
Hey, listen, the Western Mail was a useless paper when I used to run the Welsh Mirror, and that was, you know, 20 years ago. It can't be any better now.
No, I think it's got even worse, Mike. And the thing is, there's a lot of people who probably support because he keeps saying I'm keeping Wales safe, and they don't see kind of the consequences of all of these things that are happening. I just feel for a lot of these things. And you talk about the masks, Mike, and I think you'd mentioned it with Richard earlier on. Absolute nonsense from Nadeem Zahawi this week, going on with Julia saying we're going to release some evidence later this week. And I cast my eye through it. No statistical difference in wearing masks and not wearing masks in terms of students being absent. So people who support the mask have now said, well, it didn't prove that there isn't no difference. And said, well, it didn't prove that there was either. So you can't have it both ways. And what it did clearly show, Mike, is more than half of people said it made learning more difficult. 90% of teachers said it made communication more difficult. So in my words, that's making teaching more difficult. So follow the science, follow the data. This government in all 4 nations, Mike, are not doing it. And I'll just make a point on Nicola Sturgeon, just to make sure we cover off all 3 nations. Nicola Sturgeon was asked about patients who are going into hospital with COVID or with Omicron or not. And she said, I haven't seen the data on that yet. And it doesn't really matter anyway, because they're taking up a bed. And that's quite frankly nonsense, because what you need to know is how many more people are going in the hospital because of COVID or not because of it. Because if none of these extra patients, for example, were going in for it, but with it, then you wouldn't need all these restrictions. Yeah. So, you know, another leader there, Mike, who's just shambolic.
But this is it. I mean, and similarly kind of trotted out pieces of perceived wisdom and perceived fact. For example, you know, a week does not go by without somebody coming onto talk radio and saying, well, of course, you know, what we know is that by far and away the most people in hospital in a bad way with COVID are the unvaccinated. And again, if you challenge them on it, they don't really have any figures that back that up.
No, and I've covered a lot of that. I was on with Nick when he was covering your show, talking a little bit about that. It's true now. About a month ago, we were being said that 90% of patients in intensive care are vaccinated. It was 48% of the time that we had. And it's currently crept up to around 61%. Right. But what we also don't know now, Mike, and I think we might get more data released soon on some of this, because I would imagine the intensive care beds are following similar to the normal beds. So there's more people in with COVID than the kind of not in there because of COVID. But there's been a huge kind of campaign against people who are kind of unvaccinated. And Boris has come out now this week in his press conference to say, you know, if you've had 2 jabs, we're probably going to change the definition to be all fully vaccinated who don't have a booster. It's totally kind of unethical, Mike, that if you don't have a booster, you can't travel. When, you know, we know the vaccines help work. You know, if you're vulnerable, get your vaccines, get your boosters.
Yeah, but if you can't have one, though, how unfair is that you are now being made into a second-class citizen in your own country because you haven't had a vaccination, which you either can't have for one reason or another, or don't wish to have for whatever reason. I think that's entirely wrong.
No, indeed, Mike. Now, I've had two vaccines. I had COVID. I got over this more deadly variant, allegedly, than Omicron. What is the purpose of me having a booster? I don't see much benefit of having a booster vaccine. I would prefer, Mike, ethically, for my vaccine, if there's a dose there for me, to go to somebody vulnerable in some other part of the world who can't, where they haven't got the vaccines. Because ultimately, Mike, this is a global pandemic, they keep telling us.
Well,
all the new variants keep coming from all these countries that got low vaccination rate.
yeah,
So,
and I mean, of course, you keep hearing occasional words from people like Sajid Javid or Nadim Zahawi. We're not safe until we're all safe. Well, in which case, you've got to stop people coming from other countries bringing different diseases. But you can't do that. I remember doing a story some years ago of a woman getting off a plane from India at Heathrow who had the bubonic plague. And they took her off to Guy's Hospital, put her in an isolation ward, and that was fine and dandy. But, unfortunately, if you have people that travel around the world, if you have people that go to different countries, if you have people who mingle with other people, there's going to be some disease out there. You can't make everybody safe. It's a pointless activity. There's no point in even trying.
No, exactly that, Mike. And that's kind of, Omicron potentially is the savior. It's not going to be good for the vaccine companies and Pfizer because, we won't need to boost everybody every 3 months. But, allegedly we're paying over 20 quid a shot to Pfizer.
Yeah.
So,
well, they'll just have to come up with something else to sell us then, won't they?
Well, no doubt, Mike. And that's going to be a big problem. I think let's just end with a couple of positive stuff, I suppose. So the Omicron wave hit London first. The cases have come, the growth in cases has flattened right back off, and we're starting to see declines week on week. The intensive care beds, Mike, we've not seen any change really in those. So it's quite evident now that Omicron isn't leading to serious illness. Regardless, the vast majority of all those who would end up in hospital in the first wave or in the second wave have all had a booster. So I can see that we're probably over the worst of this, Mike. I think the main thing is going to be staff absences, and they're starting to come down in London as well. Right. So I think for the listeners and the viewers, don't panic too much. I think February we should be over we should be back to normal.
Jamie, I think those are very wise words. Thank you very much, as ever, for taking the time to talk to us. Jamie Jenkins, independent statistician, sensible man. Also, somebody who does actually follow the science, follows the statistics, doesn't come out with these kind of wacky, weird words where you kind of go, well, where'd you get that from exactly? But an awful lot of ministers do that. An awful lot of MPs do that. An awful lot of medical people do that. And we need to clear all of that out. We need to get rid of the sage mentality of trying to keep everybody safe and allowing people to get back to work, back to normal, back to doing what they used to do before any of this nonsense started, right?